So thank you for coming to Friday to the seminars. Today I'm happy to introduce you to Alba. She just arrived like less than a month ago. She joined the Global Change group. She's working with terrestrial ecology with antagonist. Before she did her PhD in the University of Exeter in the UK, and today she's going to explain a bit of her research during the PhD. So thank you very much, Alba. And now the room is yours.
Hi, so yeah, I'm Alba Costa, as Nico said, and I'm a new postdoc here with antagonist. And today I'm going to explain a little bit what I've been doing during the PhD, and then very briefly talk about the postdoc, very briefly. My PhD was a continuation of a study by my supervisor, Chris Kaiser-Bunbury, and collaborators, and they found that ecosystem restoration through the removal of exotic plants improved pollination in terms of network resilience and function. And the aim of my PhD was to study the responses of mutualistic and antagonistic interactions to this same type of restoration. So the removal of exotic plants. Within the mutualistic interactions, I studied seed-dispersal, and in the antagonistic ones, pre-dispersal seed predation by insects and plant-pollinator antagonists. So today, so there are 4 chapters, but today, due to time limitations, I'll talk about 2 of them: the one on seed-dispersal and another one on plant-pollinator antagonists. So to study the responses of interactions to restoration, we used a network approach and an established restoration experiment in the Seychelles. So a little bit of background about the Seychelles Islands. So the biodiversity of the Seychelles is compromised by invasive plants. These invasive plants have been reported to decimate species interactions. And in granitic islands in the Seychelles, you can find these inselbergs or rocky mountaintops, rocky outcrops. And these are very important because they act as refuges for endemic plant species. And therefore, you can find native forest remnants with a high proportion of endemism. In these forests, the progression of the invasion by plant species is kind of delayed or softened in comparison to the invaded forests in the surroundings. And therefore, we can consider these sites as islands within an island surrounded by a matrix of invaded forests, right? So this is an ideal system to study the patterns and the processes involved in the progression of plant invasions. And the restoration experiment was established in 2011, 2012 on the island of Mahé, is the main island in the Seychelles. And what we did was to study 8 inselbergs in total, and we restored 4 of them, and the other 4 were left unrestored. So in the restored sites, we removed all the exotic plant species, and in the unrestored ones, we had both native and exotic plants. The first chapter I'm going to talk about is about the seed-dispersal, the mutualistic interaction, and in this one, what we asked is whether the impact of exotic species on the seed-dispersal interactions differs with fruiting season. So we know that the dispersal of seeds by animals is being compromised by exotic species. These species can modify the composition of the community they invade and also affect the diversity and the network of interactions, right? The interactions between species. However, the magnitude of this disturbance is really variable, and it depends on multiple factors. And one of the factors that has received very little attention is the relative timing of the fruiting of exotic plants and native plants. So, for example, if exotic plants fruit at the same time than natives, we could expect that they will compete for dispersal, so for animals that disperse their seeds. But if exotic fruits outside of the main native fruiting peak, it could happen that the exotics will attract a lot of dispersers, and then this could facilitate their invasion. Here we wanted to provide information on the relative timing of fruiting of exotics and natives, and how these timings affect the dispersal of seeds and the interactions, the networks of interactions. Right, so to do so, we recorded abundances of fruits and of frugivores, and also we recorded plant frugivore interactions. And to do this, we used 4 different methods. So we identified seeds from feces from trapped animals. So we caught the animals, birds with misnets and reptiles with reptile traps with this one. And then we inspected the feces and checked for seeds. We counted them and then identified the plants. The second method was these fecal traps. So we identified the seeds from the feces collected here. The bird will be perched here and then poof, and we collect the feces. And the frugivore will be identified by DNA barcoding. So we know the plant from the seeds and the frugivore through DNA barcoding. We have the link. And we also used camera traps and direct observations of hidden frugivores. So let's look at the results. You can see here the fruiting of exotic plants in brownish and of natives in green. And we found that they fruit synchronously, but do they compete for dispersal? We don't really know this. So we was to check for changes in the dispersal of natives with invasion level. So the invasion level here is the ratio of exotic fruits to the total number of fruits. And we found that the more exotic fruits that were in the community, the lower the dispersal of natives. So there was these results support the hypothesis that exotics compete with natives for dispersal services. But these exotics, the ones that are fruiting during the fruiting peak and outside the peak will likely have different consequences for the choices that the frugivores are making, right? So, and therefore for the dispersal of seeds. Therefore, we aggregated the data, these are 10 months, we aggregated the data into 2 5-month periods. The wet season or the on-peak fruiting season and the dry season or the off-peak. And then we checked whether there were differences between those seasons. Here you can see the seed-dispersal network. So at the top, you've got the frugivores, and at the bottom, the plants. The width of the bars for the animals is the number of visits, and for the plants, the number of fruits. And then in red, we've got the exotic species, both for animals and plants, and each link is a pairwise interaction. So an animal dispersing a seed. And so here, as expected for an oceanic island, this seed dispersal network is quite small. So we've got 8 dispersals versus 25 plants. And then we can see that the dispersal that contributed the most to dispersal of seeds was the Seychelles bulbul in terms of number of plants dispersed, species dispersed, but also number of visits performed, followed by the skink and the blue pigeon. But what happens with the network structure? So we found that the structure of the network, so the size of the networks, the number of links, etc., was constant across seasons, right? But then, interestingly, when we check at the specialization of the network, so this is a metric X2' that measures how specialized the network is overall. We saw that with an increase in invasion level, there was an increase in specialization, but this was much stronger during the off-peak fruiting season. That is when the resources are scarcer. So if we look in more detail at this plot, at communities dominated by natives or non-invaded communities, it seems that so the specialization degree is similar in both seasons. So this could suggest that in these communities, there's little change in foraging behavior of the animals. But what happens if we increase the invasion level? Is there a change in behavior of the frugivores? So we know according to a previous study in our in the species in our communities, that exotic fruits have a higher nutritional quality than the native ones, right? But do frugivores prefer these fruits or not? So we looked at selectivity index and found that frugivores prefer exotic fruits, but only during the off-peak. So when there's a scarcity of resources, frugivores will go and eat the exotic fruits, but not when there are lots of them around. So these, the consequences of this could be a lower dispersion of native fruits, right? Because they have a preference for exotic ones, and also that frugivores have to change their behavior, and this can have a negative effect on their fitness. Right, conclusions. Sorry. Species roles also. We check the differences in native dispersers and exotic dispersers, right? Whether we're performing a different role. Here you see the number of months that these species were dispersing, and including the native ones and brown exotic ones. And we also checked a couple of species level metrics that measure how many species, how many plants each frugivore is dispersing, and also how much do the plants depend on them for dispersal. And overall, we found that natives provide a better dispersal service. They disperse for longer and they disperse more plants. So in this case, what we can say is that exotic frugivores arriving to the community are not replacing the function of the natives, because that could be the case, but not in our system. And now, yeah, conclusions. So by putting synchronously with natives, the exotics seem to have a negative effect on the dispersal of native seeds. Then we saw that the impact of exotics on seed dispersal differs with season. So in this type of studies, it's very important to consider the temporal component to see the changes or the effects of the human stressors on interactions. It's important to take into account the seasonality. And then that these native forest remnants or restored communities are really important to preserve the potential for regeneration of these forests, and also to preserve the plant-frugivore interactions. And if you are still there, I'm going to talk more about the antagonistic interaction. And in this case, we tested the effects of two invasive ants on the pollination of native plants. So invasive ants are one of the most successful invaders, and they can have really negative effects on the community that they invade. Invasive ants can act as pollinators and be beneficial for the community, but alternatively, they can also, for example, disrupt plant pollinator interactions. So they can consume the pollen directly, or they can damage the anthers. And also, since they appear in massive numbers, if they feed on nectar, for example, they will deplete large quantities of nectar, and this will mean that native pollinators lack resources, right? They can also reduce the visits by native pollinators, but to really tell if they are beneficial or detrimental to the community or the ecosystem, we really have to check what's the effect on the pollination in the plant pollinator interactions. So to do so to study the effects of ants on plant reproduction, we used an exclusion experiment, and this consisted of 4 treatments. So with this exclusion experiment, you will give selective access to different insects. So one of the treatments was the control. So we have a branch, and both flying pollinators and ants can access the branch or the flowers. The other one is complete exclusion, so we will put a pollination bag so nothing can access the flowers. Then the ant exclusion, and this one was done using a sticky barrier here at the bottom. So flying pollinators will come to the flowers, but ants couldn't crawl through here. And then the ants only, and this is a pollination bag, but slightly open at the bottom, so ants could come in, but not flying pollinators. Before setting up the treatment, we chose an inflorescence or a branch with flower buds, so flowers that are still closed. We will count them, and then we put the treatment, and every week we will check for developing fruits. And in the end, we will count the proportion of flower buds that set fruit, and that this is giving us a measure of the pollination performance. And then what we look at was also plant-pollinator interactions to look at the effects on pollination. And in this case, we recorded aggressive behavior from ants to the flying pollinators and the plant pollinator interactions in the presence of these ants. Right, so results. Here you see the fruit set, so proportion of fruits that the flowers that set fruit. And we see that the highest is at those branches with access to all insects or pollinators. The second is the flying pollinators, followed by ants and complete exclusion, obviously, because nothing is touching the flowers. What we can say from this is that flying pollinators were the best ones, and then that invasive ants were providing some pollination service, but it's much lower than the flying pollinators here. And this pattern was similar at restored and unrestored communities. Now, if we look at the plant pollinator interactions and the visits, here you have the number of visitors, so individuals visiting flowers, and the number of invasive ants that were present on the flowers. So we saw that there wasn't a change in the number of insects approaching the flowers, but there was a decrease in the number of flowers visited by these individuals. Right, so they will still approach the flowers, but when they were there, they will visit fewer flowers. So this means that there is a negative impact of the presence of invasive ants on the pollination by flying pollinators. Conclusion: invasive ants providing a pollination service, but this was very poor. And the invasive ants had an effect on the foraging behavior of native pollinators, and this could be detrimental for plant reproduction. And then this negative effect is not mitigated by the removal of exotic plants or the restoration. Right, so what I'm doing here now, I'm gonna explain very briefly the postdoc. I'm gonna be working with Anna in the ERC grant that she got, the Island Life project. And the main idea of this project is that pristine islands, so those islands that are little disturbed, that have, for example, fewer inhabitants and have fewer exotic species, are biodiversity sanctuaries, right? In terms of the species and in terms of interactions. And these species and interactions will be missing in those islands that are more disturbed. And with this project, we would like to provide more information and gain knowledge about how these pristine islands, these very fragile ecosystems, respond to global change, and particularly to biological invasions. And to do so, we will use a multi-layer approach. So for the first time, we will be collecting simultaneously data on the main mutualistic and antagonistic interactions, and then we will put them in a multi-layer network. And this will be done in 5 archipelagos in the world. So we will have a latitudinal gradient, which is really important. It will be in the Svalbard in the Arctic. In the tropics, we will have Galapagos and Seychelles, and then the Canary Islands and the Balearic Islands. And my role will be to be in charge of Seychelles and try to make sure that everything goes well there. And I'll be comparing Arid Island, which is a pristine one, with Fregat, which is a little bit more difficult. And in the next seminar, I hope to be providing some results about this project. And I would like, of course, to thank all the people that was involved in the PhD. I couldn't have done all that on my own. Yeah, my supervisor, Chris, and Ruben in Portugal, my co-supervisor, all the people in the field helping. Yeah, people in Germany and staff that help with some stats. I'll give the email because I have an email now. Yeah. So you can contact me if you want to talk or just stop me somewhere. And this is my Twitter where I mainly talk about my research. So if you want to add me, there I am. And now you can ask me anything you want. Thank you.
I just have some curiosity on the first thing you show, because you show this, that you studied the cycle on the seed production.
Yeah.
But there is any cycle also associated to birds. So do birds feed the same way along the entire season, but there is also might be any other seasonal impact on the, depending of they eat more before laying the eggs, and yes, I don't know what birds do.
Do you mean, so what we've done is to record the abundance basically,
Yeah.
and then plot it. In overall, in the wet season, you will have more fruits for sure, just because plants produce more fruits, and it's in our system is quite sequential, the fruiting, so it's not like that's a super clear season like here,
Yeah.
and then there's no fruit, so it's more like patchy.
Yeah, it's like,
In the tropics is a bit
because, just because like your hypothesis, it seems like the consumption of fruits from the point of view of the birds is constant along the year. So depending on where the peak of the fruit production will be, you will have more or less dispersion. So just to know if the birds or they behave the same way that year, or they might be like some. So it might, I don't know if it is coupled with the native plants, that when the native plants they produce the fruits, they eat more.
What we were trying to see is the synchrony. So in the end, it does, well, it doesn't matter so how much the birds are feeding. Do you mean that they could change through the season?
Yeah.
But then they will feed on earth, right? So we're trying to see the synchrony, and that's kind of standardized because they will be effects. Does that make sense? Thank you.
Interesting. I have some curiosities about your postdoc. You said you will compare one pristine island with another this not, but would you have different sampling communities within each island, or just put everything together? I don't know how big the islands are.
Yeah, I think.
Also related to that, how do you control for differences in the communities in composition, diversity, and abundance to then test the effects that you want to test?
In the postdoc, you mean?
Yeah. I mean, this is a general problem that we have. So
yeah.
we also have it.
To be honest, with the postdoc, I'm still like, I haven't been there. I don't know how the sampling is working. I know a little bit from reading the proposal, but what I understood is that within each island, there are different sampling sites. I don't know the distance because, yeah, I think Fregat is quite small, and so they are small, but I don't really have much information yet to give you, but I assume that they have considered this in the sampling. So there's already some data collected on one of the islands, and I'll be working on that, so I'll have more information soon. But yeah, you're right. We have to consider that for sure.
We always have, because I don't know. Maybe your pristine island will be also smaller, or I don't know, but maybe this is the case, and more simple in terms of species, and then
Yeah, for sure, we have
This
to,
somehow
to
should
put
be
those variables
controlled
in.
to check all the things, because otherwise you
Yeah.
don't know what's the
Yeah.
problem.
It's
Yeah.
kind of hidden behind all that, yeah.
And are you planning to have any measure of fitness of species or functionality of networks?
I don't know.
That would be cool.
I'll take notes. Thank you. Anything else? Yeah.
Can you put back the graphs on the problem with the ants and exclusive accessibility to?
The plot, you mean,
Yeah, because I'm not sure. I'm just the
this one?
yeah. So
Yeah, that one,
here you have fruit sets.
Yeah.
Because it looks like it's when there's only the accessibility for ants. You have yeah, the blue one, and it adds up when you put them together. You give access to both ants and pollinators.
and this one.
Yeah, your fruit set looks like it's the sum of the two others, more or less, of the one that is only for pollinators.
This is different, so the letters mean significant differences. So this is higher than this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because you have the following graphs shows that you have a poor diversity of flowers visited. In two slides after, you have
Yeah.
a decreasing.
But this is another experiment, so this is one experiment and the other is observation.
Yeah, but
Right.
there's a link.
I'm looking at different things. So here, I'm trying to see whether ants act as pollinators or not.
Yeah,
And in the other one, I'm trying to see whether ants are disrupting the pollination by other.
okay.
insects.
And so what do you withdraw with when you have both? Because you have a higher fruit set
Yeah,
here.
yeah, so that means that the ants provide some pollination service. But we have
So on one side,
some native ants in the system, and this is something we discussed. So it could
okay.
be that the pollinators are ants that are native. So we can use them.
Okay, because if it was only the ants, it looks like there's an increase in
Yeah.
the pollination, but the same way for
Yeah.
the other experiment on the flowers, there's a negative effect,
Exactly,
as you
so we
say.
have to consider both things. We are not saying taking only one of them, and we are saying they pollinate a bit, but the problem is the negative effect they have on the number of flowers visited, right? So it's taking both experiments into account in order to reach the conclusion. So yeah. Very much.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, okay.
Curiosity about the methodology that you use. How do you measure the range of the amount of invasive species? Because at the beginning you say that these experiments were performed the first time
Mhm.
in two different sites. In one you remove the invasive species and in the other you didn't. But then you show the graph with a range
Yeah.
of. So what does it mean, that there are places where you have more or less? Or how many measurements do you have?
So yeah, the thing is that we went there and this was restored 10 years ago. And then, well, when I studied this, it was restored 6 years before. And the thing is that when I started studying the seed-dispersal, I noticed that there was a reinvasion of the sites, right? So then we had to consider that in the seed-dispersal studies. And what we did was to use I have fruit counts. So we use the ratio of exotic fruits to native fruit, to total fruits. Instead of saying restored and unrestored, we put an invasion gradient. And that's what I've been shown. Exactly. Yeah, because there was a reinvasion of the sites, not super strong, but it had to be considered, and these things happened. So, and then for this one, I consider restored and unrestored because we consider that it wasn't that relevant for these experiments that are much focalized, while in seed-dispersal is that the process is much diffuse, let's say. That's that.
No, it's just also curiosity. I'm interested in this
Inselbergs.
Huh?
Inselberg.
Inselbergs. So because he said that they generally are harder to colonize for foreign species. And when he said that, I was like, okay, of course, because they're isolated, but I don't really understand it, thinking about it as much anymore, because don't you have birds that, I mean, you're looking at seed-dispersal by birds can fly.
Yeah.
So,
I know.
Is it- no, of course, but is it so much of a greater effort to get there?
No,
the
it's
birds?
really simple. So the.
So therefore, why would that be a more isolated place in terms of seed-dispersal?
So it's really simple, the answer. The environment at the top is not the same at the bottom. It's really harsh condition at the top, it's granitic, the soils are really acidic, the insulation is really strong. So for plants to survive there is really hard. And endemic plants are adapted to this kind of environment, but not the ones surviving. So that's what's making the delay. So it's mainly the environment and the soil conditions and insulation, not the fact that birds aren't dispersing seed, because they can fly and they can reach.
So this brings me to the second thing. In Venezuela, there is a similar, there are these towers.
The buoy, no?
Exactly. Is there a similar sort of difference in the environment on top of the tepuy and the bottom? Do you know it?
I haven't been there, but I'm sure, because it's already, I think it's even more dramatic, right? Because it's like a plateau and then really steep cliff. So I will say yes, but I don't have the data. But there are more studies on inselbergs in the world, like in other countries, and they have always found that environmental conditions are different. So like yeah, they differ. That is.
I have another curiosity for a postdoc like this. How often and how long do you go on field? It's 3 years you have,
Yeah,
and what would represent because going there is a long trip, and
I
then
have
what
to
the time,
go 4 times.
and every time you go it's for 1 month, 2 months.
A couple months and a half. Yeah. So that's the idea, to go 4 seasons. So during the first 2 years, I will go 4 times. And then there will be a PhD coming soon, Laura, and she will be there for longer periods. So, yeah,
Okay.
it's like, I'm not happy about my carbon footprint. Sorry. Yeah, I'm trying not to fly in my personal life.
Yeah. Okay.
Here.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah.